The glass lobby of Sterling Dominion fell silent when the man in the worn flannel shirt walked in a frayed leather case under his arm. Amelia Whitmore, the young CEO, known for her cold composure, glanced at his dust-covered work boots and laughed in front of the shareholders. "People like you don't belong here." She assumed he was a handyman come to beg for a maintenance job. He simply turned to leave. Then the chairman stepped out of the elevator, walked straight to him, and shook his hand. Amelia's smile froze instantly. Charleston in late autumn carried a particular kind of light gold and tired sliding low across the harbor, where the old warehouses still stood. Graham Cole had lived inside that light for almost a decade now, in a narrow brick building a few streets from the water. He ran a small print shop there, the kind that copied blueprints for contractors and surveyors, and he kept the hours quiet and the front window mostly unwashed. Most of the people who came through his door never asked his last name. He preferred it that way, because a name in his experience was simply something for other people to weigh. There had been a time when his name meant a great deal. Years earlier, before the silence, before the worn flannel shirts replaced the tailored ones, Graham had been the principal architect behind Sterling Tower, the glass spine that rose above the financial district and became the face of Sterling Dominion. He had drawn its lines on long nights when he still believed buildings could hold something human inside them. Then his wife died suddenly and without ceremony, and the part of him that wanted to be looked at died alongside her. He walked away from the firm, from the awards, from the rooms full of applause, and he never explained himself to anyone. He told himself the work he did now was honest. He measured paper, he aligned drawings, he handed contractors their rolled tubes, and took their cash. It was small, and it was clean, and it asked nothing of him but his hands. He had grown comfortable being invisible, comfortable enough that he sometimes forgot the building. Downtown still carried his fingerprints in its bones. Amelia Whitmore had no such comfort and no intention of acquiring it. At 34, she had been named chief executive of Sterling Dominion's Southern Division, the youngest in the company's history, and she wore the title, like armor, she could not afford to remove. She arrived at the office before 6 each morning and left after the cleaning crews. She had learned somewhere along the way that the moment people sensed softness in you was the moment they began to take. She was intelligent in the precise, relentless way of someone who had clawed up rather than been lifted. The board members liked her numbers and distrusted her hunger, and she felt that distrust in every meeting, in every glance that lingered a half-second too long on her clothes, her accent, the way she held a fork at the dinners she could not refuse. So she dressed sharper than all of them. She spoke faster. She made certain no one ever saw her flinch. Most mornings, the man she trusted least stood closest to her. Richard Vale had been Sterling Dominion's chief operating officer for 19 years, long enough to believe the Southern Division belonged to him by inheritance rather than appointment. When Amelia took the chair, he had quietly expected, he did not protest. He smiled. He congratulated her, and he began with the patience of a man who had outlasted 3 executives before her to teach her how things were done. His lessons always sounded like wisdom. He told her which families mattered in Charleston and which did not. He told her that the company's image was a fragile thing, easily soiled by association with the wrong sort of people. He spoke often of standards of appearances, of the line between those who built the world and those who merely cleaned it. Amelia, who had spent her childhood on the wrong side of every such line, absorbed his words like a convert, never noticing how neatly they fit the shape of her oldest fear. The chairman watched all of this from a distance. Leonard Sterling was past 70 now and rarely came to the Southern offices, but when he did, he watched people more than ledgers. He had founded the company on the belief that a firm was only as decent as the way it treated those with nothing to offer in return, and he had grown quietly uneasy about what his Southern Division was becoming. He had appointed Amelia over Richard's objections, and he was still deciding whether he had been right. The morning everything changed began with a phone call to Graham's shop. A junior coordinator from Sterling Dominion needed a complete set of original archival drawings delivered downtown before noon, ahead of a signing with a major investment fund. The drawings were stored in Graham's flat files because years ago he had been the one to draw them, and no one had ever come to reclaim them. He did not enjoy the errand, but the fund's project touched the harbor he loved, so he loaded the frayed leather case, pulled on the flannel against the river chill, and drove the short distance into the financial district he had not entered in years. He came in through the front because he had forgotten after so long away that men dressed like him were expected to use another door. The lobby opened around him exactly as he remembered it, the light falling through the glass in the precise angle he had calculated decades earlier, and for one disoriented moment, he stood still in the middle of his own design. He had walked in at the worst possible hour. The shareholders were there, and the press, and a row of investors in dark suits, all gathered for the photographs that would announce the deal. Amelia stood at the center of them, composed and luminous, in the moment she had spent her whole career building toward. And into the frame walked a middle-aged man in work boots, holding a battered case, looking around the marble as if he had lost his way. She saw the boots first, then the flannel, the unshaven jaw, the case held together with old straps. She saw in a single dismissive sweep a maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong wing, a handyman perhaps come to ask about a job, and she felt the investor's eyes flicking toward him, and away felt the careful image of the morning beginning to fray at its edge. Something in her tightened the old fear of being associated with the wrong sort, and she did what Richard had taught her to do. She closed the gap before it could spread. "People like you don't belong here," Amelia said, loud enough to carry her voice smooth and final. "The service entrance is around the side. Someone will help you there." Graham looked at her for a moment. He was not angry. He had heard worse, and he had built a life precisely to avoid needing the approval of rooms like this one. He simply nodded, once the way a man nods when a thing has confirmed itself, and he turned toward the side corridor she had pointed to, the case still under his arm. The lobby relaxed. Amelia turned back to the investors with a practiced smile, ready to recover the moment. And then the private elevator at the far wall opened, and Leonard Sterling stepped out. He was not expected. He crossed the marble, slowly leaning on a cane he used more for emphasis than need, and the room rearranged itself around him, the way rooms do around old power. The investors straightened. Richard, who had been standing near the windows, started forward to greet him. But Leonard did not stop for any of them. He walked past the shareholders, past the cameras, past Amelia entirely, and he went to the man in the flannel shirt, who had nearly reached the side door. "Graham," the old man said, and his voice filled the silence. "My God, it's been too long." He took Graham's hand in both of his and held it. The grip was not the brisk handshake of business. It was the grip of a man greeting someone he had spent years hoping to see again. "I'm sorry," Leonard went on, turning so the whole room could hear him, his eyes hard now beneath the warmth. "I'm sorry you had to walk into your own building through the back." The words landed one at a time. The investors looked at each other. A reporter near the front lifted her phone, and Amelia, standing where she had been so certain of herself a moment before, felt the floor of the morning drop away. "This man," Leonard said, his hand still on Graham's shoulder, "designed the tower you are all standing in. Every line of this lobby, the way the light falls at this exact hour, the reason you feel the way you feel when you walk in here. That was him, Graham Cole. I have been trying to bring him back to this company for 10 years. No one spoke. The smile on Amelia's face had not left, but it had hardened into something that was no longer a smile at all, a fixed and brittle thing that made her look for the first time in front of these people exactly as young as she was. Graham did not use the moment. He could have. The room would have forgiven him anything. In that instant, would have turned on the young woman who had humiliated him and made her the villain of the morning. Instead, he shook Leonard's hand. said it was good to see him, and set the leather case down on the reception desk where the drawings had been asked for. Then he stepped back, quiet, declining to be a weapon. But the damage was already done, and Amelia knew it. She finished the signing through a fog. She smiled for the photographs. She said the right things to the investment fund, and not one of them looked at her the same way they had an hour earlier. When the lobby finally emptied, she went up to her office, closed the door, and stood at the glass looking down at the harbor without seeing any of it. In the days that followed, she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She looked into the man she had dismissed. It did not take long. His name was on the foundation plaque of the building, etched in the bronze she had walked past 1,000 times without reading. Old industry articles called him a once-in-a-generation talent, a designer who treated public space as a moral question rather than a commercial one. There were photographs of a younger Graham accepting awards, standing beside a woman who appeared in several of them, and then abruptly in none. She read about the woman's death, brief and factual, in an old notice, and she read the silence that followed it in his record, the decade in which a celebrated architect simply vanished from his field. He had not failed. He had not been disgraced. He had chosen to disappear to trade a name everyone wanted for a life no one noticed, and he had been content there until a young executive looked at his boots and told him he did not belong in the building he had drawn. Amelia had built her entire identity on never being the kind of person who was looked down upon. She had taught herself to spot disdain in a glance and to answer it before it could touch her. And now she understood with a clarity that made her ill that she had become the thing she had spent her life fearing. She had stood in a marble lobby and weighed a man by his clothes, and she had been wrong about him in every way that mattered. She had a choice in front of her, and she knew exactly what it was. She could let the incident fade. She could blame the chaos of the morning, the pressure of the signing, the simple bad luck of an unannounced visitor. Richard had already begun to frame it that way for her murmuring in the hallway, that these things happened, that no one of consequence would remember it by next quarter, that a CEO could not be expected to recognize every face. The mask was still there for her to pick up. She had only to put it back on, or she could do the harder thing. She could admit not to the board, and not to the press, but to herself first, and then to him, that she had judged a human being by the surface of him and been profoundly wrong. The admission frightened her more than any board meeting ever had, because it meant looking directly at the part of herself she had spent years refusing to see. For 2 days, she did nothing, and the doing nothing felt like a slow kind of suffocation. On the third morning, she canceled her schedule. She did not tell Richard where she was going because she already understood, without quite admitting it, that whatever this was, he would want it managed, and she did not want it managed. She wanted to do it herself. She found the print shop by its address, a narrow brick storefront a few streets from the water, its window dim, a hand-painted sign above the door. It was nothing like the building he had designed. It was small and worn and entirely without ambition, and somehow that made it harder to walk toward, not easier. A woman who had clawed her way out of a place like this should have felt superior standing in front of it. Instead, she felt exposed, as though the shop could see her childhood through her expensive coat. Graham was at a wide table when the bell over the door rang, sleeves rolled, hands flat on a sheet of drawings. He looked up, recognized her at once, and did not seem surprised. He had perhaps known she would come. He did not offer her a chair or a greeting. He simply waited with the same unhurried calm he had shown in the lobby, and let her find the words on her own. "I came to apologize," Amelia said. Her voice did not sound like the one she used in meetings. "What I said to you in the lobby. I was wrong. I didn't know who you were." "That's the part that doesn't matter," Graham said. His tone held no edge. "You didn't know who I was. You decided I was no one worth being kind to. Those aren't the same mistake." The words went into her, cleanly, the way only true things do. She had come prepared to be forgiven, to have him wave it off the way people in her world waved off everything uncomfortable, and instead he had named the exact shape of what she had done and set it on the table between them. There was no anger in it. That was what made it unbearable. A man could rage and be answered. His stillness left her nothing to push against but herself. She had no rehearsed reply for that, and for once she did not reach for one. She stood in the small, bright shop, a CEO, in a coat worth more than the table he worked on, and she let herself feel, perhaps, for the first time since she had taken the chair, the simple fact that she had hurt someone and had nothing to offer, but the truth that she knew it. "You're right," she said finally. "It isn't the same mistake, and I'm not asking you to forgive the second one. I just needed you to know I see the difference now." Graham studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the first small acknowledgement that she might be a more complicated person than the one who had spoken in the lobby. He did not tell her it was all right, because it was not. And they both knew he was not a man who said things he did not mean. But he nodded once the same single nod he had given her in the lobby, and this time it meant something closer to a beginning than an ending. She left the shop without another word. Outside, the harbor light had the same gold and tired quality it always had, falling on the warehouses and the water. And the woman standing on the sidewalk, who no longer knew for the first time in years exactly who she was supposed to be. She had walked in certain of her power and walked out stripped of the story she told about herself. And somewhere beneath the fear of that almost too quiet to notice was the faint and unfamiliar feeling of being finally honest. The apology did not settle anything, which was the first thing that surprised Amelia. She had imagined that saying the words would close the matter the way a payment closes a debt. Instead, she carried the encounter back downtown with her, and it sat in her chest through the rest of the week, refusing to be filed away. Graham, for his part, returned to his drawings and expected nothing further to come of it. He had taken the measure of the young woman and found her more honest than most, but honesty was not the same as trust, and he had built his quiet life specifically to avoid the kind of people who lived in glass towers. He assumed the chapter had closed. He was wrong, because Leonard Sterling had other plans. The old man came to the print shop himself a week after the incident in the lobby. He lowered himself onto the only spare stool, set his cane against the table, and told Graham what he wanted. The city had finally approved the renovation of the historic harbor district, the row of 19th-century warehouses near the water that had been left to rot for a generation. Sterling Dominion had won the contract. Leonard wanted Graham to advise on the design. "I have plenty of architects," Leonard said. "What I don't have is someone who'll fight to keep the thing human. You used to do that better than anyone alive. The harbor deserves it. So do I before I'm done." Graham looked at the old man for a while before answering. The harbor meant something to him that he did not say aloud. His wife had loved those warehouses, had walked him through them in the early years, when they were both poor and full of plans, and the thought of someone else flattening them into luxury frontage had bothered him for a long time, without his ever intending to do anything about it. Leonard had found the one project Graham could not entirely refuse. "I'll do it," Graham said at last. "On two conditions. I don't appear in any of it. No press, no photographs, no name on the plaque this time. And I stay out of whatever happens inside your company. The politics, the meetings, the maneuvering. I advise on the building and nothing else." Leonard agreed without hesitation, and the two men shook hands a second time in a small print shop far from any cameras. What neither of them said, though both understood, it was that the renovation fell under the Southern Division, which meant Graham would be working every day with the woman who had told him he did not belong. Amelia received the news from Leonard's office rather than from Richard, which she noted. She was to lead the harbor project as the division head, and Graham Cole would serve as senior design advisor, reporting his recommendations directly to her. The arrangement was almost unbearable in its symmetry. The man she had humiliated was now a daily fixture in her working life, and she could not refuse him without exposing exactly the flaw she was trying to bury. The first weeks were stiff and careful. They met in a converted office near the waterfront, surrounded by surveys and renderings, and they spoke only of the work. Graham was precise, demanding, and utterly without flattery. He rejected the firm's first 3 concepts, outright calling them expensive ways of erasing history. And he did it so calmly that Amelia found herself agreeing before she could defend the work her own teams had produced. She had expected to resent him. Instead, she found that working beside him exposed how little of her own authority was built on substance. In the boardroom, she ruled through speed and certainty, through never letting a silence sit long enough for anyone to question her. Graham was immune to all of it. He let silences sit. He answered her sharpest questions with longer ones. And slowly, against every instinct she had, she began to want his good opinion, which frightened her more than any hostile board ever had. The tension between them was not only professional, and they both felt it without naming it. There was something in the room when they worked late, an awareness that neither acknowledged a charge that came from the strange intimacy of 2 guarded people circling the same problem. She told herself it was only respect. He told himself it was only the work. Neither was being entirely truthful. Richard Vale watched the arrangement curdle from his own perspective. He had expected the lobby incident to weaken Amelia, to make her dependent on him for guidance through the scandal, and instead, it had thrown her together with a man Leonard Sterling treated like family. He saw the way the old chairman's eyes followed Graham, the way the harbor project had been carved out and handed to the 2 of them, and he understood with the cold instinct of a man who had survived 19 years that his path to the chair was being quietly closed. He had never intended for Amelia to lead the division for long. He had supported her appointment precisely because he believed she would stumble, and that her stumble would deliver him the chair he felt he had earned. The lobby should have been that stumble. The fact that it had instead drawn her closer to Graham and to Leonard's favor was to Richard an outcome that needed correcting. He began in his patient way to look for the correction. The work pushed Amelia and Graham closer, whether they wished it or not. One night, deep into the planning, they stayed long after the rest of the team had gone arguing over the central question of the project, whether the old warehouses should be open to the public or sealed behind the kind of exclusivity the investors wanted. The argument went past the building and into something else, and somewhere in it, the careful distance between them finally gave way. "You keep fighting for the people who'll never afford to live here," Amelia said. "Why, you don't owe them anything." "I owe them what every building owes the people who walk past it," Graham said. "The chance to feel like they belong in their own city. You'd understand that better than anyone, I'd think. You didn't always have a coat like that." The remark was not cruel, but it found something. She looked at him, and the polished surface she presented to every room cracked quietly in the empty office by the water. "No," she said. "I didn't." And then, without quite deciding to, she told him. She told him about a childhood spent in places not so different from the ones they were arguing over, about a mother who cleaned other people's houses and came home too tired to speak, about the particular shame of being the one whose clothes were wrong, whose name was on every list of families behind on something. She told him about the wealthy people who had looked through her as though she were furniture, and how she had promised herself, with a fierce and private certainty, that she would never be looked through again. "So I learned to look first," she said. Her voice was low and even stripped of the boardroom entirely. "I learned that if I decided who didn't matter before they could decide it about me, it couldn't touch me. I got very good at it. Good enough that I did it to you in my own lobby without thinking twice." Her hands rested flat on the table, the way his had the day she came to apologize. "I became exactly the kind of person who used to make me feel like nothing. I just did it from the other side of the room." The office was quiet around them, the harbor dark beyond the glass. Graham did not reach for comfort because comfort would have been a lie and she would have known it. He gave her something truer instead. People who get hurt badly enough, he said, usually turn into the thing that hurt them. It's the most common story there is. The cruelty doesn't disappear when it lands on you. It just looks for somewhere new to live, and the easiest place is your own hands. The word sat in her for a long moment. No one had ever described her to herself so precisely, and the strange relief of being seen all the way through nearly undid her. This was the center of everything the night she stopped performing and let another person look at the actual shape of her fear and armor and all. Graham saw it too, and what he saw changed how he understood her. He had taken her for cold in the lobby, simply cold, the way the wealthy were cold. Now he understood that the ice was not the absence of feeling, but a barrier built around far too much of it by a woman who had been taught that softness was something other people punished. He did not forgive the lobby in that moment, but he stopped seeing her as the woman who had spoken there and started seeing the frightened person underneath who had been speaking for years. What neither of them knew was that they were not alone. Richard had not gone home. He had come back for a forgotten file and seen the light in the waterfront office, and he had waited in the dark lot until the two of them finally stepped out the door, together, closed the CEO's polished mask gone, the architect leaning near her in the spill of light from the entrance. He could not hear the words. He did not need them. With his phone raised only a few yards away in the shadow of a parked truck, he photographed exactly what he wanted. The photographs to show two people who looked like far more than colleagues. He understood at once what he held. It did not matter what had actually passed between them. A confession of childhood poverty would mean nothing to a board. But clear images of the division's CEO alone at night, with the project's advisor, close unguarded, intimate in the language of pictures, that was a weapon that needed no truth behind it. He went home and began to build his case, with the calm of a man who had finally found his correction. The blow came 2 weeks later, and it came formally. Richard submitted a written complaint to the board of Sterling Dominion, alleging that Amelia Whitmore had entered into an inappropriate personal relationship with a project advisor, that she had compromised the firm's judgment and exposed it to reputational risk in front of the very investors the harbor project depended upon. He framed it as reluctant duty, a senior officer forced to act for the good of the company he loved. He attached the photographs. The images did exactly what he intended. To anyone who wanted to believe the worst, they were damning a young CEO and an older man alone after hours the body language of people who had forgotten to be careful. Richard circulated them to the board with a sober note about standards and appearances. The same vocabulary he had spent months feeding Amelia now turned around and aimed at her throat. He had taught her to weaponize image. Now, he used image to destroy her. The board convened an emergency hearing. Amelia received the notice on a gray morning and read it twice before its meaning landed. After months of clawing for legitimacy, she stood to lose the chair within her first year, not for any failure of competence, but for a fabricated story dressed in photographs. The cruelest part was that the story used the truest night of her life, the one evening she had finally been honest, and turned it into evidence of a crime she had not committed. Graham learned of it the same day, and for the first time since the lobby, his calm broke. He had asked for exactly one thing in exchange for his help to stay out of the company's politics, and the politics had reached past him and seized the woman beside him regardless. He understood instantly that he was the lever Richard had used. His presence, his closeness had been turned into her undoing. The guilt of that landed harder than any insult ever could. The hearing was held in the main boardroom on the upper floor of Sterling Tower, in the building Graham had designed under the light he had calculated. The irony was not lost on either of them. Amelia walked in alone in the sharpest armor she owned and faced a long table of directors who had never fully trusted her and now had a reason, however manufactured, to be rid of her. Richard presented his case with the practiced regret of a man performing reluctance. He spoke of the firm's reputation, of the delicate confidence of the investment fund, of the impossibility of a leader whose personal conduct could be questioned. He let the photographs speak for him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had built the room's mind for months, and now he simply collected the harvest. When it was Amelia's turn, she did something the room did not expect. She did not deny the lobby. She named it herself before any director could raise it, and she owned it fully. She said that she had judged a man by his clothing in front of all of them, that it had been the worst thing she had done as their CEO, and that she was not too proud to say it aloud. The honesty disarmed the directors who had expected defense, and several of them shifted, uncertain now of the story they had been handed. But on the fabricated charge, she did not bend. She told them plainly that the photographs showed two colleagues working late on a project the company had assigned them, that there was no relationship of the kind alleged, and that she would not bow her head to a lie no matter how convincingly it had been arranged. She did not name Richard. She did not yet have the proof to. She simply refused to confess to something she had not done, and she let the refusal stand. Richard watched her and believed he had won anyway. The denial sounded to him like exactly what the guilty always said. The photographs remained on the table. The directors remained uneasy. He had spent 19 years learning that in a room like this, the appearance of wrongdoing was wrongdoing, and that a young woman with an admitted lapse and a folder of incriminating images had no path left. He allowed himself the small private smile of a man watching a plan complete itself. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened, and Leonard Sterling came in. He had not been scheduled to attend. He crossed to the head of the table with the same unhurried authority he had brought to the lobby weeks before, and the room rose slightly without meaning to. He set his cane down, looked at the photographs, looked at Richard, and then addressed the board in a voice that left no space for interruption. He told them that the complaint before them was not what it appeared to be. He told them that the entire matter, the photographs, the timing, the careful framing, had been engineered by the man who had filed it, and that he had not arrived at this conclusion that morning. He had been investigating Richard Vale quietly for more than a year, long before the harbor project, long before the lobby, ever since the patterns in the division's politics had begun to trouble him. The room turned. Leonard laid out what his own quiet inquiry had gathered, the trail of maneuvering the manufactured leverage, the long campaign to undermine every executive who stood between Richard and the chair he believed he deserved. The photographs, he said, were simply the latest instrument, a night of honest work twisted into a weapon. He looked at Richard directly as he finished. "You decided this company belonged to you," Leonard said. "It never did. It belongs to the people who walk into its buildings and to the way we treat the ones who can offer us nothing in return. You forgot that a long time ago." Richard was suspended on the spot in front of the full board, his 19 years collapsing in the space of a single sentence. He did not perform reluctance now. He gathered his folder, with hands that were not entirely steady, and left the room he had been so certain he would soon command. Amelia should have felt triumph. The lie had been exposed. Her chair was safe. The man who had tried to destroy her was finished. But standing in the boardroom at the top of the building, Graham had designed with the light, falling exactly as he had planned it. Years before, she understood that the deepest failure of these months had never been the threat to her title. It was the moment in the lobby. It was that she had once looked at a human being and seen only the clothes he wore, and that no verdict from any board could undo the fact that she had done it at all. The boardroom emptied slowly after Richard was gone, but Amelia stayed at the long table for a while, looking at the light moving across the floor. She had kept her chair. She had won by every measure her old self would have counted. And the victory felt strangely hollow, because she understood now that the thing she most needed to fix was not on any agenda the board could vote on. In the days that followed, she found herself looking at Sterling Tower differently. She had walked through its lobby for a year and seen only a stage, a place to be photographed, a backdrop for the image she maintained. Now she began to notice what Graham had actually built. The way the entrance drew a person in without intimidating them. The way the light fell so that no one, regardless of how they were dressed, felt small standing in it. The building had been designed to make people feel they belonged, and she had stood in the middle of it and told a man he did not. She raised it with him one afternoon at the waterfront office, where they still met over the harbor drawings. She told him she finally understood what the tower was, for that he had not designed it to display power, but to dissolve the distance between the people who entered and the people who already felt they owned the place. That's what it was supposed to do, Graham said. Whether it still does depends on who's standing in the lobby. He did not say it as an accusation. He said it as a simple fact, and she took it as one. Graham kept his distance from her in the weeks after the hearing, and she did not press him to close it. He had come back to the work for the harbor, not for the company, and the scandal had only confirmed the wariness that had driven him out of that world in the first place. He had heard too many handsome promises from people in towers. He had watched a night of honest conversation turned into a weapon. He was not in a hurry to believe that anything had truly changed, least of all a person. Amelia accepted that, which was itself a change. The old version of her would have managed him, would have found the lever that turned distance into approval. Instead, she simply kept showing up to the work and let her conduct speak in place of persuasion. She had begun to understand that the hardest thing in front of her was not running a division. Plenty of capable people could move numbers and manage investors. The genuinely difficult thing, the thing she had failed at completely in that lobby, was learning to look at a person and see them clearly without the armor of judgment she had carried since childhood. The harbor project filled the months that followed, and then the better part of a full year beyond them, and it consumed Amelia in a way that no project had before. She stopped leading from the upper floor of the tower and started spending her days at the waterfront. She walked the warehouses with the engineers. She learned the names of the laborers restoring the brickwork and the names of their crews. She sat in on the meetings she would once have delegated, the ones with the technical teams and the trades, and she listened more than she spoke, which was perhaps the largest revision of all. Her leadership changed in ways the board noticed and did not entirely know how to categorize. She made fewer grand pronouncements. She stopped dressing the division for the cameras and started building it for the work. The people below her, who had spent a year braced against a CEO who seemed to look through them, found themselves addressed by name, asked for their judgment, and credited for it in front of others. The fear in the division thinned. The respect that replaced it was the kind that could not be manufactured, because she had earned it one ordinary interaction at a time. Graham watched all of this without comment, but he watched. He saw her stand in the mud of the harbor site, in boots, not so different from the ones she had once sneered at. He saw her defend the public walkways against the investors, who wanted them sealed, using the same argument he had made to her on the night everything turned. The change was not performance. He had spent a career learning to tell the difference between people who adjusted their image and people who adjusted themselves, and he understood slowly and against his own caution that she belonged to the second kind. Nearly a year after the hearing, on a clear afternoon in early winter, the renovated harbor district opened to the public. The old warehouses had been preserved rather than erased, their brick and timber kept honest. The waterfront opened so that anyone in the city could walk it freely, whether or not they could afford a thing inside. It became almost at once the most loved public space Charleston had built in a generation, and the investors who had wanted it, sealed, found to their surprise that an open harbor was worth more than a private one. There was a ceremony modest by the standards of Sterling dominion held on the new waterfront, with the restored warehouses behind it. Leonard Sterling spoke briefly, leaning on his cane, looking out at a crowd that included as many dock workers and tradespeople as executives. Then Amelia took the small platform, and she did something the company had not seen her do before. She thanked Graham Cole by name in front of everyone. The photographs she had once feared, now simply cameras she no longer cared about. She did not thank him the way the company usually thanked its talent, with a recitation of his genius and his awards. She thanked him for something else. She told the crowd that when she had arrived at this company, she had believed that respect was something you protected by keeping people beneath you, and that one man had shown her, without ever raising his voice, how completely wrong she had been. She said the harbor was his design, but that the more important thing he had built that year was the person standing in front of them, and that she was a better one than the woman who had taken the chair. Graham stood at the edge of the crowd, exactly where he had asked to be, out of the photographs and away from the platform. He had told Leonard he wanted no recognition, and Amelia had honored that in the only way that mattered, by giving him not the credit he had refused, but the truth he had not asked for. He did not smile in the way the cameras would have wanted, but something in his face eased the long wariness, loosening by a degree, as he listened to a person he had once written off entirely speak about him in a voice that had nothing left to perform. He stayed on with the company after that on his own terms, not as a returning legend, not as a name on a plaque, but as a part-time advisor who came in when the work was worth his hands and went home to his print shop when it was not. Leonard never pushed for more, and Amelia never tried to manage him into it. They had both learned that the surest way to keep him was to ask nothing of him he did not freely give. A winter afternoon, some weeks after the opening, found the two of them on the upper floor of Sterling Tower, standing at the wide glass that looked down over the city and the harbor beyond. The low sun caught the tower's face and threw a pale gold light across the water, the same tired, beautiful light that fell over Charleston at the end of every short winter day. Below them, the lobby Graham had designed received a steady stream of people coming and going through the front doors, none of them sent around to the side. Amelia watched them for a while before she spoke. The question she asked was not the kind she would once have allowed herself, because it had no strategic use and no safe answer. "Do you believe people can really change?" she said. Graham did not answer right away. He looked down at the lobby, at the marble, where not so long before a man in work boots had been told to use the service entrance by a woman who was certain she knew exactly what kind of person he was. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and about how little of it had been crossed by argument, and how much by the slow, unglamorous work of a person deciding to become someone better. "Yes," he said at last. "When they learn to look at other people the way they'd want to be looked at themselves, that's the whole of it. Most never manage it. The ones who do change all the way down." She kept her eyes on the people moving through the lobby below, and she understood that he was answering more than her question. He was telling her, in the only language he trusted, what he had concluded about her over the long year of work, that she had managed the thing most people never did, and that he had seen it happen. They stood together at the glass without needing to say more. Two guarded people who had each spent years building walls against the world, watching the city carry on beneath a building designed to make every one of them feel they belonged. The harbor glinted at the edge of the light. The lobby filled and emptied and filled again. And somewhere in the quiet between them was the understanding that the most important thing either of them had built that year had not been made of brick or glass at all. Status can make a person admired. A title, a tower, a name carved into bronze, all of it can fill a room with deference and turn heads when its owner walks in. But none of it answers the only question that finally matters about anyone, which is how they treat the people who can do nothing for them, the ones with empty hands and no leverage and nothing to offer but their presence. Amelia Whitmore had learned that the hard way in a marble lobby in front of the people whose opinion she had thought she lived for. She had looked at a man and seen his clothes, his boots, the worn case under his arm, and she had decided in an instant that he was no one. And the man she had dismissed had turned out to be the one who built the very world she was standing inside of, the floor beneath her feet, the light on her face, the room she had believed belonged to her. The lesson she carried out of that year was not about architecture, and it was not about power. It was that the value of a human being cannot be read off the surface of them, off their clothing, or their work, or the way they happen to look when they walk through a door. The person dismissed today may well be the one who built the ground that others stand on so confidently, and the only people who never learn this are the ones too certain of their own height to ever look down and see who is actually holding them up.